The bus wheezed to a stop in a swirl of dust, its brakes groaning in protest as if even the vehicle didn't want to come this far out. Into the middle of nowhere, Emily stepped down, clutching the worn leather strap of her single suitcase. The wind hit her first, sharp, dry, and carrying with it the scent of sagebrush, sun-baked earth, and something faintly metallic she couldn't place. Her boots sank half an inch into the loose dirt, and she found herself staring out at a horizon that seemed to stretch on forever in every direction. The Wyoming plains had a way of making you feel small, like a single grain of sand in a vast desert. Asterisk, she'd been warned. Everyone in town had looked at her as if she'd just signed her own death sentence. When she said she'd taken a job at the Morgan Ranch, no one lasts a week there. The bus driver had muttered earlier, shaking his head as if she were about to walk into the lion's den. They'd all had a story about Jack Morgan, the man who ran the ranch like a general runs a battlefield. Some said he'd fire a worker for missing a fence post by an inch. Others swore he never smiled, never laughed, never said please or thank you. They painted him as more machine than man, but the pay was good, and Emily didn't have the luxury of being picky. She needed this job. Asterisk, by the time she saw the ranch's main gate, a heavy, weather-worn wooden arch with Morgan carved deep into the beam, the sun had climbed high enough to set everything aglow. The barns loomed in the distance, massive and red, their sides faded by years of heat and storms. Wooden fences cut through the open fields like scars, holding back herds of cattle and horses whose silhouettes moved slowly against the gold and green backdrop. The air buzzed with the sound of cicadas, and somewhere far off, a windmill squealed as its blades turned lazily. Asterisk, he was there when she arrived. Jack Morgan. He leaned against the main fence, one boot hooked over the bottom rail, his hat tipped low enough to hide his eyes, even from a distance. She could tell he was a man who filled every inch of his own shadow, tall, broad-shouldered, his arms crossed in a way that made his presence feel both unshakable and unwelcoming. She'd expected him to at least offer a nod, some kind of basic acknowledgement, but instead, he just studied her, slowly, like a man appraising the worth of a horse that might not even be worth the feed. Asterisk, you're late, he said, his voice deep and gravelly. The words weren't shouted, but they landed with the weight of a hammer. Emily glanced at her watch. She was right on time, but she bit her tongue, refusing to give him the satisfaction of a protest. Asterisk, I came straight from the bus stop, she said evenly. Asterisk, Jack didn't answer right away. His eyes, now visible under the brim of his hat, were the color of old whiskey, sharp and assessing. Finally, he jerked his chin toward the barns. You'll be in the bunkhouse, 4 a.m. start. Don't wander, don't be late. If you can't keep up, don't waste my time. Asterisk, that was it. No welcome, no instructions beyond the bare minimum. He turned and walked away, his spurs clinking softly against the packed earth, leaving her standing there with the weight of the heat pressing down on her. Asterisk, the bunkhouse was a long, narrow building at the far end of the ranch, the kind of place built for practicality, not comfort. Inside, the air smelled faintly of old wood, sweat, and saddle soap. Rows of narrow beds lined each wall, the mattresses thin and sagging, the blankets rough to the touch. A small table in the corner held a coffee pot that looked like it had survived at least 3 wars. She found an empty bed near the window, set her suitcase down, and sat for a moment, listening to the distant sounds of the ranch, the rhythmic pounding of hooves, the low rumble of cattle, and somewhere, the deep, commanding voice of Jack giving orders to men she hadn't met yet. Asterisk, that night, as the sun sank behind the mountains, Emily sat on the edge of her bed, watching the last light of the day bleed orange and purple across the horizon. The air was cooling now, carrying with it the faint sweetness of wild grass. She could hear the creak of the bunkhouse settling, the occasional muffled laugh from one of the ranch hands in another room, and the distant whinny of a horse. Her body felt heavy from the long day of travel, but her mind was restless. Asterisk, she thought about the way Jack had looked at her, not with curiosity or even suspicion, but with the cold certainty of someone already convinced she'd fail. It sparked something in her, a stubborn ember that refused to go out. She didn't know exactly why she felt the need to prove him wrong, but she did. Maybe it was because she'd spent so much of her life underestimated. Maybe it was because she knew what it was like to have no one believe in you. Asterisk, whatever the reason, Emily made herself a quiet promise before she pulled the thin blanket over her shoulders. She wasn't going to be just another name in the long list of people who'd quit the Morgan Ranch. She was going to last here. She was going to make it work. Asterisk, even if it killed her. The alarm ripped her from sleep long before dawn, its shrill ring cutting through the cold stillness of the bunkhouse. Emily groaned, pulling the rough wool blanket tighter for a moment. Before she forced herself to move, the air bit at her skin, the kind of chill that made her breath fog, and her fingers stiffened as she laced up her boots. Outside, the world was still wrapped in darkness, the stars fading slowly against the first faint gray of morning. Somewhere beyond the barns, a coyote yipped, answered by another farther away. By the time she stepped outside, the ranch was already stirring. A handful of men were crossing the yard, toward the stables, their boots crunching on the frost-hardened dirt. Lantern lights spilled out from the barn doors, flickering against the wooden walls. She caught the scent of hay, leather, and horses, strong and sharp in the cold air. And for a moment, despite her nerves, it felt alive in a way no city morning ever had. Jack Morgan was there, of course, his presence impossible to miss. He stood by the corral, a steaming mug of coffee in his hand, his breath rising in faint clouds as he watched the men work. Emily half expected him to ignore her like the day before, but his eyes tracked her as she crossed the yard. There was no greeting, just that unreadable stare and a curt nod toward the tack room. You'll start in the stables, he said, his voice as rough as gravel under a wagon wheel. Muck out the stalls, brush down the horses, check their water, feed at 6 sharp. Don't miss a stall, and don't mix up the feed, unless you want a dead horse on your conscience. Emily nodded, biting back the urge to remind him she'd grown up around horses. She didn't want to hand him an opening to accuse her of talking too much or thinking she knew better. Instead, she pulled on a pair of work gloves from her bag and stepped into the barn. The work was grueling in its simplicity. Each stall held the smell of animals and hay and the sharp tang of manure. The horses shifted and snorted as she worked, their dark eyes following her. Some were curious, leaning their heads over the gates to nudge her shoulder, while others stood in the shadows, watching in silence. She moved steadily from stall to stall, lifting pitchfork after pitchfork of soiled bedding, replacing it with fresh straw that rustled under her boots. Her back began to ache before the first hour was over, but she kept her pace, determined not to give Jack or anyone else a reason to doubt her. The brushing was harder, not physically, but emotionally. These were powerful, finely bred animals, their muscles rippling under sleek coats. She remembered the mare in stall 3 especially, a tall chestnut with a scar across her flank, who watched Emily with wary eyes. When she approached, the mare shied, but Emily's voice softened instinctively. She spoke to her in the same low, steady tone she'd used as a girl, grooming her uncle's old gelding. Within minutes, the mare relaxed, leaning into the brush strokes, her ears flicking forward. She didn't notice Jack standing at the end of the aisle until she heard his voice. She doesn't let most people touch her. Emily glanced over her shoulder. He leaned against the barn wall, arms crossed, his head casting his face in shadow. She wasn't sure if it was a compliment or a test. Guess she's not as mean as people think, Emily replied, her voice light. Jack didn't smile. She's not mean, she's cautious. There's a difference. Then, as abruptly as he'd appeared, he pushed off the wall and walked away, leaving her wondering if she'd passed some invisible measure. By 6. Her gloves were stiff with dirt, and the horses were fed. The sun had risen just enough to spill pale gold light through the open barn doors, catching in the dust motes that hung in the air. Emily leaned against the stall door for a moment, catching her breath, when one of the older ranch hands, a weary man with weathered skin and a crooked grin, stepped inside. Name's Tom, he said, tipping his hat. You work fast. Didn't think you'd make it past the first hour. Thanks, she said, unsure if it was meant as praise or surprise. Tom chuckled. Don't thank me yet. Morgan's got a way of testing folks. You think you're doing fine. Then bam, he throws something at you just to see if you'll fold. Emily frowned. Sounds charming. Charming's not his game, Tom replied. But if you can handle it, this place ain't so bad. The rest of the morning was a blur of work. Hauling feed, scrubbing water troughs, stacking hay bales until her arms trembled. Jack was everywhere. In the corral barking instructions, in the barn checking harness straps, in the field inspecting fence lines. He didn't hover over her, but she always knew when his eyes were on her. She caught him watching as she hefted a bale onto the stack, his expression giving away nothing. By noon, the sun was high and the work slowed just enough for lunch. Emily sat on the back steps of the bunkhouse, eating a sandwich she'd packed from the town diner the day before. Her muscles screamed in protest. But there was something satisfying about the exhaustion. It was real work, the kind that left dirt under your nails and the taste of dust in your mouth. Asterisk from her spot. She could see Jack near the water trough, speaking quietly to one of the younger hands. He glanced over once, just briefly, before turning back to his conversation. She didn't know if it was a good sign or nothing at all, but for the first time since she'd arrived, she felt the faintest sense that maybe, just maybe she might not be entirely unwelcome here. Asterisk still, she knew Tom was right. Jack wasn't done testing her, not by a long shot. Asterisk, and if the way his gaze lingered on her that afternoon was any indication, the next test might be coming sooner than she ought. Under the blazing Texas sun, the ranch seemed to hum with life, horses snorting in the distance, cattle lowing beyond the pasture, and the wind carrying the smell of hay and dust. Clara stood near the corral, her hands wrapped tightly around a wooden brush as she worked through the coat of a restless mare. Just a few weeks ago, the very idea of working here had made her stomach twist. Everyone in the small town had warned her, "Don't take the job at Mason Blackthorn's ranch. He's heartless, impossible, mean as a rattlesnake." But the truth she had seen in these weeks was far more complicated than the rumors. The man they called cruel had, in small, almost hidden ways, then revealing something else, something gentler, though wrapped tightly in a shell of gruffness and pride. Asterisk, she still remembered the first time she saw him smile, a real smile, not the tight, sarcastic smirk he wore like armor. It had been 2 days ago, when she'd returned a runaway calf he thought had been lost to coyotes. The relief in his eyes had quickly shifted into that same rough tone he always used, telling her she'd finally proved she wasn't just here to look pretty in boots. But his voice had softened just enough for her to catch the truth. He was impressed. Asterisk now. As she worked in the corral, Mason was leaning against the fence, head tipped low, watching her. "You've got a way with horses," he said, his voice deep and calm. "Most folks just try to force him. You don't." His words startled her, not because of the compliment, but because it was the first time he'd acknowledged her skill without following it up with a jab. She smiled faintly, brushing the mare's neck. "Maybe they just need a little kindness," she replied. He chuckled, a low, genuine sound, and for a moment, the air between them felt different. Asterisk later that evening, the ranch house kitchen glowed with lamplight. Clara sat at the big wooden table, sipping coffee while Mason stood by the counter, his sleeves rolled up as he sliced into a loaf of fresh bread. "You're not what I expected," he said suddenly. Without looking at her, she tilted her head. "And what did you expect?" He glanced at her finally, a flicker of a smile tugging at his lips. "Someone who'd quit by the 3rd day." She laughed softly. "Guess I'm tougher than I look." His eyes lingered on her a moment longer than they should have. Then he looked away, placing the bread on the table. Asterisk, by the end of that week, she wasn't just surviving the work, she was thriving in it. She'd learned to herd cattle at dawn, to cook hearty meals for the ranch hands, to mend fences with hands blistered from hard labor. But more than that, she'd learned to see Mason for who he truly was, a man who had been burned, who had built walls so high that no one dared to climb them, and somehow, without meaning to, she'd begun to scale those walls brick by brick. Asterisk one afternoon, a storm rolled in suddenly, dark clouds swallowing the horizon. Clara had just managed to bring the horses into the barn when lightning split the sky and rain poured down in sheets. She turned to find Mason standing there, soaked to the bone, carrying a shivering newborn calf in his arms. "Found her in the mud," he said, his voice rough, but his eyes betrayed worry. Without thinking, Clara took the calf from him, wrapping it in a blanket and kneeling beside the stove in the tack room. He watched her work, his jaw tight, and then he knelt beside her. "You're something else, you know that?" he murmured, almost to himself. Asterisk when the storm passed and the sky blushed with sunset, they stood in the barn doorway, the smell of rain fresh in the air. Mason's hand brushed hers, just barely, and she felt a spark that had nothing to do with the lightning. "You've made this place feel different," he said quietly. "Better." Her heart ached in a way she hadn't expected. She realized then that she had come here for a paycheck, but what she'd found was something far more valuable: purpose, belonging, and maybe, if she dared to believe it, the beginnings of love. Asterisk by the time night fell, the ranch was quiet, save for the soft sounds of the animals settling in. Clara stepped out onto the porch, the cool breeze lifting her hair. Mason was there, leaning against a post, a thoughtful look in his eyes. "You know," he said slowly, I never thought anyone could make me glad they took this job, she smiled, her voice warm and certain, and I never thought I'd be glad I did. Somewhere in the silence that followed, under the stars and the hum of the night, something unspoken passed between them, a promise of more to come, built on trust, hard work, and the unexpected sweetness that had taken root in the very place she had feared the most.